Finally, I can get rid of this trash. We've never needed someone like you. My mother-in-law, Emily, spoke those unbelievable words with a cold, hateful gaze that made me feel utterly despised. Shocked, I stared at her, but she didn't change her expression at all. For 7 long years, I had endured her treatment, but this morning, something happened that I could no longer ignore. I had finally told my husband, Mark, I wanted a divorce. The moment I said it, Emily unleashed that barrage of verbal abuse. It became painfully clear that she never considered me part of the family. Yet, in a moment of desperation, I glanced at my husband, hoping he might defend me, hoping that maybe he would stop his mother from saying such cruel things. But to my dismay, he said something even more hurtful. Mom's right. You're useless. Get out of here already. His gaze was just as cold as his mother's, and it hit me like ice. In that instant, I felt myself growing calmer. The realization dawned on me that the 7 years of suffering I had endured were completely wasted. I see. Now I understand how you all feel. If my own husband won't take my side, then staying here is pointless. In fact, my presence here is more harmful than helpful. With that realization, I knew I had made the right decision by reaching out for help yesterday. Just as the thought crossed my mind, the doorbell rang. I quickly responded, saying yes, and made my way to the front door. As I walked, I could hear the cruel voices of Brian and the in-laws behind me, shouting for me to get out. Ignoring their words, I calmly reached out for the door chain and unlatched it. As soon as I opened the door, their loud yelling abruptly stopped. My name is Sarah, and I'm 33 years old, a stay-at-home mom. I never had an easy life, and even my marriage was no exception. My parents divorced when I was in elementary school, a moment that shaped my childhood. I'm sorry, Sarah, but from now on, your mom and I will live apart. I remember being in 2nd grade when my father broke the news. It was the first real turning point in my life. I had never seen my parents fight before, so I couldn't understand why this was happening. But Mom and Dad, you get along so well. Why would you say something like that? I'm so sorry, sweetheart. But it's already been decided. My mom tried to soothe me, gently stroking my head. Be a good girl and listen to what we say, okay? You'll stay with your mom, but I'll always come and visit whenever I can. I didn't understand why they couldn't be together anymore, and it broke my heart. I don't want to be away from Dad. Will I ever see you again? My father hugged me tightly, his voice trembling. Of course you will. I'll always come see you whenever I can. Even though I couldn't fully grasp the situation, his words comforted me. True to his word, my parents arranged regular visits, and though we lived separately, I still felt like we were a family. My mom moved us into her parents' home, where my grandparents helped raise me while my mom was busy working. Since my mom worked long hours, it was my grandparents who truly took care of me. I'm sorry, Sarah. It must be hard. But your mom isn't a bad person. She loves you. That's right, sweetheart. And we'll always be here for you, okay? They showered me with love, trying their best to fill the void left by my parents' divorce. Still, as much as they cared for me, I always felt something missing. I never told them how lonely I really felt, because I didn't want to make them feel sad. It wasn't until I was older that my father told me their divorce had been amicable. As a child, though, I was deeply hurt by their separation. When my father finally explained the situation to me, I felt a huge sense of relief. He told me that my parents had loved each other, but certain circumstances had made living together impossible. This gave me hope that maybe one day we could be together again. Despite living separately, I knew there had been love between them, and that thought helped heal the wounds of my childhood. Although I was surrounded by love from my family, I still carried a sense of emptiness inside me. After graduating college, I got a job at a large department store in the city, following in my mother's footsteps. The reason I chose that particular job was because it was connected to my mother's work. While I admired my mother's career, I couldn't fully connect with her as a mother or a wife. Deep down, I struggled with how to feel about her, unsure if I truly understood her. When I became a working adult, I hoped that following in her professional footsteps might help me understand her better. I threw myself into my work, and soon 3 years had passed. That's when my second turning point came. One day, the owner of the department store, who was also the father of my future husband, arranged for me to meet his son.
Sarah, you're such a hard worker. I'd love for you to meet my son and consider marrying him.
I had reservations about marriage, but his insistence led to a formal meeting with his son, Mark. Mark was set to take over the family business, and his father saw me as a suitable match due to my experience working at the department store.
Even without the business in mind, I want to build a warm, loving family with you, Sarah.
I had shared my fears about marriage with Mark during our first few conversations. I told him about my parents' divorce and how my mother was often too focused on work, leaving me feeling neglected. I also confessed that I wasn't sure I could trust the idea of marriage.
Your mother sounds like a remarkable woman. I'm sure she loves you deeply, even if she couldn't always show it.
He was patient and understanding, carefully addressing each of my concerns.
I felt lonely as a child, too. My parents were always busy, and I rarely got their attention.
Mark's eyes were gentle as he spoke, and I could sense that he truly understood my feelings. That's why I know we can build a strong and loving family together. His sincerity touched me, and I started to believe in him. I convinced myself that someone who understood loneliness as I did would surely value family and make it a priority. Before I knew it, we were engaged, and everything moved quickly from there. After our wedding, we moved into a beautiful home that Mark's parents had arranged for us, and I thought we were starting a perfect new chapter together. A year later, I found out I was pregnant, and both Mark and his parents were thrilled. I, too, was overjoyed and excited to start a family, vowing to cherish this new chapter in my life. Looking back, I realized this was the happiest time in my marriage. It was the calm before the storm. Things changed drastically when we learned I was expecting a baby girl. I'll never forget the look my father-in-law David gave me when I told him. It was as if he looked down on me for not giving birth to a male heir.
A girl? Why couldn't you have a boy to carry on the family name?
His words were harsh, and his demeanor frightened me. Until that moment, my in-laws had treated me kindly, but now it felt like their warmth was replaced by contempt.
Oh, Mark, you really picked a disappointing wife, didn't you?
Emily, who had always been friendly, suddenly began to mirror her husband's disdain. Worse yet, Mark did nothing to defend me. No matter how many times I asked him to stand up to his parents' cruel comments, he simply ignored me. Soon he stopped listening to anything I had to say. With Mark's silence, my in-laws felt free to escalate their insults and mistreatment. When I mentioned my plan to return to my parents' home for the birth, they became even more aggressive.
You're part of this family now, Sarah. You don't have a home to return to.
And being pregnant doesn't mean you can't do housework. At the time, my in-laws lived nearby, but they began to spend more and more time at our house, treating it as if it were their own. Despite my nausea and fatigue, Emily insisted that I continue doing all the housework.
Pregnancy isn't an illness, dear. Housework is the duty of a wife.
One day, when I was feeling particularly unwell, I accidentally upset Emily by replying in frustration when she criticized how I folded the laundry.
You're folding it all wrong. It's going to wrinkle by the time we wear it.
I was so exhausted that I responded without thinking. I'll fix it later. Emily's face turned red with anger.
How dare you talk back to me, you insolent girl?
From that point on, her treatment of me became even worse. Despite everything, I held on and eventually gave birth to my daughter. Even then, I wasn't allowed to contact my own mother, as my in-laws insisted they would take care of everything. Later, I found out that they had told my mother not to worry because they would handle everything on my behalf. I spent those early days of motherhood feeling incredibly lonely, longing for the support of my own family. After some time, I returned to my home, but I was met with another shock. While I had been in the hospital, my in-laws had moved into our house without my consent. Worse yet, they had taken over the room I had prepared for my baby and relegated my newborn and me to a small, cluttered storage room. Despite my fragile condition after giving birth, they continued to treat me like a servant, forcing me to cook and clean for them while they did nothing. They even had the nerve to tell others they had moved in to help me during my recovery.
Our poor daughter-in-law is still bedridden, so we moved in to help her.
Of course they did no such thing. My husband, who had taken paternity leave, spent his time out with his parents, while I was left alone to care for our baby. He had shown no interest in our child and continued to act as if neither of us mattered. On weekends, he often stayed out all night, and I began to suspect that there was more to his behavior than just a lack of interest in our family. Though I had no concrete proof, a growing sense of unease took hold of me. The thought of divorce crossed my mind, but I quickly pushed it away. Despite everything, I didn't want my daughter to experience the same loneliness I had growing up. At the time, I believed that if I could endure the hardship, it would be enough to protect my daughter. But I was wrong, as I would soon come to realize. My in-laws were very concerned with appearances and treated me and my daughter well in front of others, giving the illusion of a perfect family. Even neighbors admired how kind my in-laws were and how well my husband cared for us. We played the part of the perfect family, but it was all a facade. Then one day, my husband began pressuring me for a second child, this time a son.
People are starting to ask about a second baby. We need a son for the family name, so we better get on it.
He constantly pushed me to get pregnant again, despite the fact that I was exhausted and struggling with the stress of raising our daughter. His parents also began to berate me, claiming I was a failure for not producing a male heir.
You can't even give us a son or do the housework properly. Why did we even bother letting you marry Mark? You really are a disappointment.
Despite everything, I tried my best to care for our daughter and shield her from the hostility around us. By the time my daughter turned 7, my in-laws and husband had all but ignored her. She had become scared of them, and I could see the fear in her eyes whenever they raised their voices. I did everything I could to shower her with love and protect her from the toxicity of our household. Then one day, something happened that finally made me wake up and decide that I couldn't live this way anymore. Emily did something unforgivable. She tried to harm my daughter. I was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when I suddenly heard my daughter's cries coming from upstairs. It was unusual because she almost never went up to the second floor, so I rushed to see what was going on. When I reached the top of the stairs, I saw Emily standing over my daughter with her hand raised, ready to hit her. Instinctively, I ran to my daughter, pulling her into my arms. She clung to me, sobbing uncontrollably. I held her tight and looked up at Emily, who stared down at us with a cold expression. "What were you trying to do to my daughter?" Emily clicked her tongue dismissively. "Nothing." Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving us there in shock. Just then, Mark stepped out of the bedroom and saw us. His face twisted into an annoyed expression. "Mark, your mother just tried to hit our daughter." Mark simply sighed and clicked his tongue, just like his mother.
What did Katie say to upset her? It's probably your fault for not raising her right. Stop bothering me with this stuff.
He left without listening to another word, clearly not interested in what had happened. I was left there, holding my crying daughter in the small room we had been relegated to. It was a storage room where we had been forced to live since she was born. I gently stroked her hair, trying to calm her down, even though my own heart was racing. "Katie, sweetheart, what happened? Can you tell Mommy?" Through her sobs, my daughter explained what had happened. Apparently, Emily had called her upstairs away from me and threatened her. When she reached the top of the stairs, Emily had tried to hit her. She handed me a small piece of fabric torn and shredded. "Grandma took this from me. She said if I didn't come upstairs, I wouldn't get it back." It was a handkerchief, one I had embroidered with my daughter's initials, a gift I had made for her and something she cherished. My heart broke. This was more than just an object. My daughter had loved that handkerchief, and Emily had used it to manipulate her. I hugged my daughter tightly, relieved that I had gotten to her in time. I didn't want to think about what could have happened if I hadn't. That was the moment I realized I couldn't continue to let this happen. I couldn't keep putting my daughter through this nightmare. That same day, I called my mother and told her everything. She was shocked, but immediately agreed to take Katie in for a while. I dropped Katie off at school, and then I drove straight to my mother's house, where I knew my daughter would be safe. That night, I decided to confront my husband and in-laws about what had happened. As I approached the living room, I overheard their conversation, and it made my blood run cold.
You should have been more careful, Mom. This morning was a close call. I didn't expect Sarah to come running so fast. I thought I had more time.
I stood frozen outside the room, listening in disbelief as they casually discussed what had happened as if it were nothing.
If you're going to do something like that, at least don't make it so obvious. We don't want anyone finding out.
I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were openly discussing harming my daughter, as if it was just a small inconvenience.
Maybe next time we'll have her pull weeds in the heat. That'll teach her.
My heart raced, and I could feel the room spinning around me. In that moment, I realized I had been wrong to endure all of this for so long. I had convinced myself that my situation wasn't that different from my own childhood, growing up with divorced parents. But I had been so wrong. My parents may have divorced, but there was love in our family. My father and mother cared for me deeply, even if they couldn't live together. I wasn't unhappy. I had been wrong to think that staying in this toxic environment was best for my daughter. There was no love between me and Mark, and certainly none between me and my in-laws. They didn't see me or my daughter as family. They saw us as burdens. It was time to leave. It was time to save my daughter from this. I made up my mind. I would get a divorce and protect my daughter. I immediately called my father, and he was furious when I told him everything. He promised to help me, and I began packing my belongings. As I packed, I remembered a conversation I had with my daughter that morning. "Katie, would you be okay if Mommy and Daddy lived in different places?" "Yes, Mommy. I want that. I want to live with you." Her response was so sincere, and it hit me like a lightning bolt. How could I have been so blind? My daughter had been suffering just as much as I had, if not more. She had been hiding her pain just like I had been. It wasn't just me who'd been enduring this nightmare. It was both of us. That realization made my decision even clearer. I wasn't going to let this continue, not for one more day. I apologized to Katie for not realizing sooner. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. Mommy should have done this a long time ago. But I promise we're going to be okay." That evening, the doorbell rang just as my in-laws and husband were shouting at me to leave. I ignored their insults and walked calmly to the front door. When I opened the door, my father was standing there.
"Sarah, I'm here to take you home. Let's go."
As soon as my husband saw my father, his expression changed from smug to panicked.
"What are you doing here?"
My father was calm, but I could see the anger simmering beneath the surface as he stared at my husband and in-laws.
"It's been a long time, Mark. I'm here for my daughter." "Mr. Johnson, wait. There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake. I've heard everything."
My father's voice was calm but firm. Mark and my in-laws stood frozen, unsure of what to do. My father was well known in the business world, and he had done business with Mark's family store for years. What they didn't realize until now was that my father was the largest supplier for their store. They had always looked down on me because I came from a divorced family, but they had never bothered to find out who my father really was. Now they were about to understand.
"It's unfortunate, but given the circumstances, I'll have to reconsider doing business with you moving forward."
Mark and his parents' faces went pale. They knew what that meant.
"Wait, please, Mr. Johnson. This is a misunderstanding. Sarah is just upset."
My father raised his hand, silencing him.
"There's no misunderstanding. I've seen how you treated my daughter, and I will not allow it to continue."
He turned to me, his expression softening.
"Sarah, let's go."
He took my bags, and without another word, we walked out the door. As we walked to my father's car, I could hear Mark and his parents scrambling behind us, pleading for forgiveness, but we didn't look back. We got in the car and drove away, leaving that life behind. When we arrived at my parents' house, my mother was waiting with open arms. She hugged me tightly, tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I should have been there for you sooner." "No, Mom. I'm sorry. I should have come to you for help a long time ago." I couldn't stop the tears from flowing as I apologized. My mother and father were there for me, and for the first time in years, I felt safe.
"Don't worry, Sarah. We'll handle everything. You and Katie are going to be okay now."
Over the next few weeks, my father helped me finalize the divorce. He also made sure Mark would pay child support and alimony. In the meantime, Katie and I stayed with my parents, and for the first time in a long time, we found peace. Katie started a new school, and she quickly adjusted, making new friends. She was smiling and laughing again, something I hadn't seen in far too long. But, just as we were settling into our new life, Mark tried to cause trouble again. One day, I got a call from Katie's school. A man had showed up claiming to be her father, demanding to take her home. We didn't let him see her, but we thought you should know Katie was really upset when we told her. I knew it was Mark. He had already lost the house and was clearly struggling after my father cut off all ties with his family store. I rushed to the school, and when I got there, I barely recognized the man waiting in the office. It was Mark, but he looked completely different. Unkempt, with disheveled hair and worn-out clothes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days.
Sarah, we need to talk.
What are you doing here? You have no right to be near Katie. Mark's face twisted into a desperate look, and he stepped closer to me.
My parents' store went under after your father cut us off. We lost everything.
I stayed silent, waiting for him to continue.
We need to get back together, Sarah. For Katie's sake. I'll fix everything, I promise.
I could see right through him. He didn't care about me or Katie. He only cared about getting his comfortable life back. But there was no going back, not after everything that had happened. We're not getting back together, Mark. It's over. His face contorted with anger.
You're making a mistake. You need me. You've always needed me.
I don't need you, Mark. I never did. And Katie and I are doing just fine without you. Mark's face fell as he realized I wasn't going to budge. He let out a frustrated growl and stormed out of the school. That was the last time I saw him. A few months later, I heard that his family store had gone bankrupt and that his parents had passed away. Mark had lost everything, including the family business and his parents. I didn't feel any satisfaction or joy in hearing about his downfall. If anything, I felt sorry for him. But my focus was on Katie and rebuilding our life together. My parents supported me every step of the way, and over time, I started working for my mother's jewelry design business. It turned out I had a talent for design, and with my mother's guidance, I started to build a new career. Katie was thriving too. She adjusted well to her new school and was full of life again. One day, while we were talking about our future, Katie mentioned something that made both my parents and me smile. I think I want to work with Grandpa one day and travel the world. My father laughed and asked if she was serious.
Well, if you want to join me, you'd better learn to speak fluent Japanese first.
I'm already learning, Grandpa. We all laughed, and for the first time in years, I felt a deep sense of peace. Our lives had been full of hardship, but now we were finally free, and that was enough for me.